Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. The United States has been running a lot of freedom of navigation ops recently in the South China Sea. Jim, what are the chances of something accidentally happening, and how would that end?
Well, from the Chinese point of view, it would end with a lot of wheels spinning to shut down the fighting. One thing that China is how should I put it, focused on, and has been since they began building up their military. And they discuss this semi-openly. You know, there's unclassified professional journals and what have you, where, you know, and these get translated by the CIA and the Defense Department and what have you. But it's tough going. You know, it's like the War College reviews and what have you. Not a big circulation. But these articles seriously address the problems that the PR people will not let out into the wild. And that's why our coverage is always focused on the corruption in the military. Corruption in the military isn't ancient. I mean, thousands of years old. There are records complaining about it. Not just the Chinese, but also the Babylonians. Some of the when we started translating the old cuneiform from the Tigris Euphrates Valley, the civilizations 4,000 years ago. Aside from trivial, so and so owns me 2 donkeys for the so many pounds of kilograms of wheat ice gave him. A lot of it had to do with how should I put it? Punishments inflicted upon officials who had charge of the military and were basically stealing a lot of it. So some traditions just, they're like cockroaches. They'll survive anything. And corruption in the military, which we're seeing now, I mean, now it comes up occasionally. General Eisenhower warned of it. But, there it is. You seemingly it's like the tide. You can't stop it. You can whip it with chains, but that's theater. It keeps on coming. The Chinese are, how should I put it, intent on bluffing their way through this. You notice they haven't used any force. They occupy, for all practical purposes, the South China Sea. The only people who basically defy them are outsiders. In other words, people who don't come from the neighborhood, in non-East Asians and Southeast Asians. They do get some pushback from Indonesia, and of course Japan and China and South Korea and China are having this tug of war, but very gentlemanly. There's no contact. It's like touch football. Over some disputed islands. It's a much smaller thing, between, South Korea and Japan and China, whereas the South China Sea involves, a huge area. But the Chinese are basically being bold because nobody is stopping them. The FONOPs, the Freedom of Operation, patrols, are at the front. But hell, they outright broke the law, and an international court, affirmed that yes, China is breaking the law by, asserting ownership of, 2 million square kilometers of the South China Sea. So if anything happens, I think you'll see some, if there is a clash. And actually, what you'll probably see, this gets back to the chicken of the sea period after, in the 1950s. For those of us who have either studied it or old enough to have lived through it, there was a period in the 50s and 60s where the American electronic Eland aircraft flying in international waters off the coast of Russia were literally attacked. There were several dozen fatalities. And the same thing was going on at sea. our surface ships or actually intelligence gathering ships, were basically shadowing at a proper, according to the rules of the sea, distance. Russian ships operating on the high seas. And the Russians basically started saying, well, we can't have this, chase them away. And you had the same kind of stuff you see going on with China now. They would have their warships, play chicken of the sea, play chicken, literally. And there were some small collisions and what have you. And eventually in the 70s, there was a treaty signed saying, all right, we outlaw chicken of the sea. Because the Americans apparently said, you want to kill us, we'll kill you, tit for tat. The China, there has no such deal been made with China because China feels it isn't being as stupid as the Russians. The Chinese think all Westerners are dumb. They have all sorts of nasty things to say about it. Some of them are true, but a lot of it's just the usual. We're superior, the master race, et cetera, et cetera. Chinese have been doing it a lot longer than than the Nazis or anybody else in the West was, they will basically come up with some clever stratagem to say, all right, it was an accident. Look what happened in 2001 with the American Eland aircraft that was clipped by a Chinese fighter and went down. Well, it didn't go down. It had to make a crash landing in Hainan Island. The Chinese pilot and his aircraft went down, and he didn't survive. So no punishment involved, no punishment required there. But that was stupid. We analyzed that to death, and it was obvious that the Chinese pilot, had orders to sort of, fly close and send the message, but he decided to play cowboy, and he didn't have enough airtime, and he basically boom, so he died for it. But we may have lost a lot of intelligence, collecting, knowledge, because apparently our guys weren't able to destroy as much as they were supposed to before they touched ground and were arrested. But the Chinese quickly, they didn't drag that out. They said, all right, well, we'll take your plane apart to make sure there's no hidden, bombs or anything, and then we'll let them go. But they didn't want to go to war over it. And if there was an incident at sea between warships where if they opened fire, that would be their worst nightmare, because they'd have to basically say our sailors are incompetent, some idiot, they'd have to basically put a bunch of officers and sailors in prison and make a big show of it. Of course, they quietly let them loose as soon as they felt they could as the years went by. But by then it would have calmed down, and we aren't going to you can't revive that state of tension, 5 or 6 years later. But that seems to be their SOP, their standard operating procedure. They don't publish it, but they discuss it. Because right now, at this moment, there is a lively discussion going on within the Chinese military about how screwed up are we. Because the Chinese, the senior leadership, look at, they've been basically trying to clamp down on the corruption in the military for over 20 years. At first they said you got to get out of business. You can't, then there was a crackdown on the military procurement system. A lot of sweetheart deals going on there. They started putting officers and now some generals in jail for getting too greedy or getting caught. I suppose the Chinese would look at it. But now this discussion is again being raised of it's not just the thieves in uniform we have to worry about, it's the pretenders. They're literally saying many of our officers are simply making it look good. And when they get out there, this is especially true with the ground force. The Navy is another situation. This has always been the case. You can't fake it if you're spending a lot of time at sea. And we've warned that the Chinese have warships. Not only do they have a lot of new warships, but they're spending a lot of time at sea. And when they started, 15 years ago, sending a task force to join the International Anti-Piracy Patrol off Somalia, we watched them like a hawk because this is their first long-range deployment ever. The Chinese, there was the treasure fleet in the 15th century, but that's that exploration was very successful, and then a new emperor came to power, and they burned all those ships. But that shows you how they look at these things. Do not, build a armed force, a navy, because we don't need it. And so just having a large navy is an enormous change in Chinese military thinking. And for thousands of years, they simply didn't do it. It wasn't we don't need it, but now they need it. And this is where you get to the crux of the matter of China getting involved in a war. They do the math. They're not as dependent on exports as they used to be, but they're as more dependent on imports. They have to import most of their oil. They have to import a lot of their ores and raw materials for manufacturing. They have to import some of their technology still. And of course, exports account for a large chunk of employment in China still. They're trying to turn it into a consumer economy. They're having a big problem with that. Let me put it this way. They are far more vulnerable to a cutoff in trade, a massive cutoff in trade, not just a tit for tat the Americans the United States is doing to them now. But boom, because we could blockade the Chinese ports just by the threat. The insurance companies would shut them down. That people couldn't trade the rates. In other words, we can disrupt without winning an outright military victory. We can disrupt maritime traffic to China, simply by making declarations. And the Chinese are aware of that. They think, we have all sorts of plans. They're putting most of their faith in electronic disruption, and they may have a case there. Nobody knows. They come up with some really scary weapons, but they never test them. For example, their new well, not new, it's been around for years. Their steerable ballistic missile that can hit a carrier at sea. They have never tested it. It's no big deal. We've covered this several times. It's no big deal to test it. If you want to scare the Americans, you take basically a about to be scrapped, bulk, cargo carrier, some ship that's about the same size as a carrier, an American carrier, put it under remote control. This is not high science. It's done, occasionally for testing military weapons. Take it out into the West Pacific. Warn everybody, stay away. We're going to do a live ballistic missile test in this area. So aircraft and ships stay away, but they know the satellites will be watching. And they launch it. We have the satellites that detect, ballistic missile launches. We track it. We have eyes on the large, bulk carrier down there, and we see the splashdown. If the splashdown is in that carrier, we are worried. If it misses by a couple of miles, well, that was interesting. Try again. They haven't even been willing to try. China will put lives and reputation at risk to try new weapons. They lost a lot of sailors getting their conventional submarines, how should I put it, fit for regular overseas service. I mean, they lost entire crews in some cases due to stupid mistakes. But that's how any navy becomes, a powerful naval power, by keeping ships at sea continually, for years at a time. They've been doing this. They're scary. So we know they can navigate. They still occasionally run aground. It's easier to do in the South China Sea because that's relatively shallow waters. But at the same time, they're basically trying to bluff their way into eventually being able to get away with claiming, control. Because even though the international courts have gone against them, and that was a case for the Philippines part, the Chinese are in the process of buying everybody off. I mean, this goes back to Zhen Zhu, the ancient Chinese, military philosopher, who pointed out, quite practically, that yes, you need a large and powerful army, but if you have to capture a fortress, it's easier to do with a large bribe, or as he called it, with a donkey load of silver, than it is to basically lose thousands of expensively equipped and trained soldiers, trying to take the place. And from the Chinese viewpoint, and of course many the Byzantines were famous for this. The Romans actually did too, but the business that Greeks got stuck with the reputation for that being a bad thing. It isn't, and and the Chinese still fervently believe in it. So they are basically trying to buy the South China Sea. And again, they feel that if they get enough countries, ASEAN and all the countries they are investing in with their Belt and Road Initiative and what have you, they'll be able to say, look, all of our neighbors agree with us. It belongs to us. You wait, and then they start playing the evil Western colonial card, which most people in the Far East don't believe, especially since they got rich off the Western investments and purchases of goods manufactured in East Asia. But they're talking about a propaganda campaign, and that's what they're building up to. So, bottom line is, any clash, whether it's accidental or some local commander, having a bad day or whatever, will be quickly backpedaled. I mean, that's what they discuss. How do we extricate ourselves with minimum loss of face? Which is how it basically translates into English. They have more colorful ways of putting it in Mandarin. But so, quite frankly, they have no intention of letting any clash out there escalate, not just because of the military risk, but the economic risk. Because if the economy goes through a collapse, which it would, I mean, the economy is already in big trouble because of too many bad loans. Sound familiar? Something China went through, a real estate bubble in the 90s they haven't recovered from. I remember in the 90s, up until the mid-90s, people were still saying, oh, the Japanese are going to take over the world's economy, et cetera, et cetera. Then all of a sudden, their real estate bubble burst, and they're still basically dealing with the fallout from that. But the other thing that hit the Chinese in the 90s was the first affluent generation had come of age, and they weren't having children, which is basically the curse of the middle class. It goes back to ancient history. The nobilities of ancient Rome, the wealthy families of ancient Rome, and the nobility of, say, medieval Europe, they didn't. Most of them, families that died out, didn't die out from combat or civil war, what have you. They died out from not having enough heirs. Because a wealthy, a aristocratic woman, her idea of marriage was one heir, one spare, then that's it. Play with your mistresses, and I'm going to party. And that happened. You don't have to be an aristocrat for that to happen. It happened in Europe as they became more affluent after World War II. It's happened in South Korea, and now it's happening in China. So they have practical problems that have nothing to do with war. The last thing they want is a war, especially with America, because you got to remember. Let's look in a larger strategic sense. We have nukes that can reach all of China. They don't have nukes that can reach all of the United States, so they haven't really got a nuclear threat. I mean, yeah, they could do some damage. Their biggest threat is hacking, is being able to bring down the internet. But even then, that's a self-inflicted wound, and that's what's worrisome about China talking about basically cutting off establishing a China-centric internet. It still would have connections to the outside world. It's like the one they have in North Korea. It's basically a big intranet. Just an internet just for North Korea. And there are a few pipes you need special permission, and a high security clearance to get onto, where you can access the World Wide Web. But China and Russia are talking about doing that. And other countries have to, even the United States. It's come up. Why don't we just, basically, seal ourselves off, or make it easier to basically cut ourselves off? Fortunately, the internet was designed to make that very difficult. And that's why nobody except North Korea has been able to do it. And North Korea did it because they had so few pipes going out in the first place. They basically established internet technology in North Korea, but there was no ISP, as it were, serving North Korea. And they got one or two lines from China. There was for a little while they were using a satellite link, And so this is obviously a restricted net that is easy to monitor and control. China wants to do it for the whole country. Now, they're the biggest internet population in the world, and that might be useful, but they still need it for their international trade. But so you expect to see more proposals from them, to basically establish a Chinese internet while still having enough international access to keep academic and economic and government and whatever relationships going. So this is the crucial thing. Now, what I've been talking about here is all three of us are old, war gamers. We were in the business at one point or another in the years past, and in doing a combat a war simulation, one of the first questions you have to ask is, what are the victory conditions? Why are these two people or three people or whatever groups fighting each other? Because that's what drives, the decisions you're supposed to make in this simulation. And as we all discovered, because we're all designers, as well as, we're players, it's sometimes difficult to do that because you're looking for, well, what were they trying to do in early stages of World War One, and it becomes very interesting. It really gives you a new insight into history, and that's the way the three of us are thinking here in China, in the South China Sea. What are the Chinese victory conditions? And that's an excellent question because most people in the West haven't got a clue what they are. They're not conquering the South China Sea. They are, and the Chinese have several terms for it, they are absorbing it, just like they're doing in Shanxi, with the Uyghurs, the Turkic Muslims up in northwestern China. The Uyghurs are basically opposing China, not because of religion, not because they're Islamic fanatics, and very few of them are, but because they see what's happening to them is what happens to foreign people, non-Han Chinese. Remember, Han Chinese, that's the ethnic group, genetically and what have you, culturally, are the majority of Chinese, and they are 20% of the world's population, and they know that. And they say, well, that's the way it should be. Maybe we should be more. But what they try and do is, if they can't get you to basically, try and become, second-class Han, they basically try and send in Han Chinese colonists, which is what they're doing in Shanxi. And they're now, the non-Chinese are now the majority. And they're also basically making it more difficult to speak Turkic languages. They're controlling religion. Now, they do this to everybody. They're not picking on the Uyghurs, or the Muslims, the Christians, you name it. The Chinese government wants to control, religious leadership and religious practice. And the Uyghurs are opposing this. Now, the Uyghurs are basically like many, people on the periphery of China's borders. There's a pattern. You'll notice on both sides of China's land borders, there are peoples who got there because they didn't want to be absorbed by the empire. And you had two choices, either submit, well, three choices really, submit, die, or flee. And a lot of people flee, entire groups. And they're all over Asia, northern Burma, South Vietnam, Vietnam, central Vietnam, in parts of India, all around the periphery. There are groups like the Uyghurs who said, I do not want to, become Sinified, Chinified, as it were. But China knows this works, and the neighbors do too. And if they want to maintain their cultural independence, you want to play ball. I mean, but then again, a lot of people say, well, how far does the new Chinese want to expand? They've never gone overseas before, as a government. And so now, Australia's getting nervous because, the Chinese are talking about setting up artificial islands at atolls out in the Pacific. I mean, deep out, not just in these shallow waters of the South China Sea. And they're saying, my God, how far will it go? Well, nobody knows. The Chinese don't know because this is all new territory for them. So that's dangerous. But the one thing that hasn't changed is their aversion to getting involved in a war. They tried fighting China, over 100 years ago in the 1890s. They got wiped out. It was embarrassing because the Japanese had never been known as, were never an overseas, conqueror, but they picked up all this Western technology and they just, boom, they blew right through the Chinese. Then they basically had the Civil War. They overthrew the Manchu Empire, and then the Chinese started coming in, and that's when they realized the only way we can defeat a technologically superior foe is not through direct combat, but through the ancient method of absorbing them. And basically, they wore the Japanese down, and then of course Japanese made the mistake of going to war with the United States, with the West, and boom. It was soon all over, and Japan was in ruins. But Japan came back, and that worries the Chinese a lot. They're not just using the traditional, racism and hey, you did me a wrong, and you should be guilty, and guilt is in the vocabulary in that part of the world, especially in Japan. But they're basically being the big bad. Remember, Napoleon said, 150 years ago, China is a sleeping dragon. When it wakes, the world will tremble. Well, it wasn't just Napoleon. I dug into that. There were a lot of Westerners who weren't as quick with a quip as Napoleon was, or as famous as he was. But a lot of Dutch and English traders, muttered among themselves, as it were. What if the Chinese, what if they wake up, as it were, from their slumber? And then, indeed, there are some documents, basically confidential information to Englishmen, young Englishmen, and the Dutch had similar stuff, going to do business in China. They said, forget all you've heard about the Chinese. When they're doing business, they are world class. I mean, I'm translating this into 21st century English. They are formidable, and if you're not careful, they will basically, do what you think is a fair deal and take you to the cleaners. And this is one reason why Great Britain was in making no problem, providing no problems when the lease on Hong Kong came up. Said, all right, according to the lease, it's yours now. Bye bye. They basically learned the lesson, but many of the politicians and diplomats did not, and they try and look at China in Western terms. It's a fundamentally different culture, and one thing that culture is averse to is getting into a fight you're not absolutely. Well, no, let me put it this way: they don't really believe in the thing that's popular in the West that has caused so many wars, is that we can win this. Let's do it. No. The Chinese say, let some other fool try that. That's what Sun Tzu was basically, advising people to do 2,000 years ago. Machiavelli, in a certain way, was saying the same thing. Don't get involved in a head-on fight. Nobody wins. Look for another way, and that's the traditional Chinese donkey load of gold or silver, to buy whatever you're trying to get. But we are averse to that. Culturally, we're down upon that. But the Chinese say that's the highest form of warfare. Don't fight unless you absolutely have to. And they want to fight as the victim. They want to be playing defense, not offense. That's why they're trying to turn, the South China Sea into enough of a generally recognized, at least in East Asia, Chinese property that we will basically be facing an overwhelming attack by our allies, a diplomatic attack, saying, look, Yankees, go home, forget about it. The Chinese, we can trust them. We have no choice. You do. So don't basically burn the place down, over this silly dispute, which is not really a dispute, blah, blah, blah. You start to hear that out of some of our Asian allies, as it were, who have already been bought and paid for by the Chinese. Because that's how they roll. So there we are. That's how the Chinese would react to an accidental war.
Well, Austin, that's quite a riff. How do you follow it up?
I see all kinds of scenarios that can get out of hand. I don't disagree with Jim that the Chinese are on an absorption strategy, but that's still an invasion. They've invaded the South China Sea. They've broken international law, totally ignored it. The arbitration court in The Hague ruled in the Philippines' favor on all but one of the complaints that the Philippines had, and it was minor. All of the territorial complaints the Filipinos had vis-a-vis China, the court upheld and accused China fishermen of robbing fishing grounds and Filipino resources. So in the Chinese absorption scenario, some of the neighbors don't want to be absorbed. Vietnam among them, the Philippines, why even a Chinese enclave called Taiwan. They don't want to be absorbed, and they have they're overmatched completely by China, and which is why China wants to excuse me. Wow. Which is why China wants all of these confrontations to be bilateral. Big China, the aggressor Big China, against smaller Vietnam, not an alliance of ASEAN nations or an alliance involving the United States, which could be a mix of nations, and it could be the Quad, which we've talked about, the quadrilateral strategic dialogue that is Japan, Australia, the U.S., and India, by the way. And I see potential scenarios that, not potential scenarios, I see potential warfare in the South China Sea sparked by tensions between India and China. Let's talk about the economic threat to the Chinese Communist Party's regime, which Jim did. That's very real. And economic slowdown, loss of citizen cooperation. That's something that the dictatorship fears. That's why they have, come on, what's the social credit system? Which
yes.
We've written down. Yeah.
Social credit rating, SCR.
That's it. All right. But they're afraid of loss of cooperation. And who knows, you have a revolution, complete disgust with corruption. And Jim writes about that all the time and covers it in detail on the strategy page. But you reach a point where the Tiananmen Tiger, which is the term I like to use, bites back. Let's say the U.S., and here and I'll get into the speculative scenario, Dan, the U.S. sides with the pro-democracy elements, and it's going to use its economic power to help the pro-democracy side. Think a little bit about Venezuela, even though I know China's not Venezuela. But the military authoritarians want to teach the U.S. a lesson, and they're going to teach the United States Navy a lesson. And with all those anti-ship missiles they've got on their islands in the South China Sea, call it a trigger finger fun up is what it would be. And they shoot, and now you've got a confrontation between the U.S. and China. Now there's in Cocktails from Hell, my new book, I discuss in some detail what I call a media engagement in the South China Sea, and that's ultimately a sea battle. That is a short but deadly war between the U.S. and China, with the Philippines and Vietnam likely U.S. allies. And there are a lot of things that could kick that off. I went with one that involves palace intrigue in Beijing. But Chinese and Filipino vessels exchange fires. The Filipinos don't want to be absorbed. U.S. Navy attempts to intervene or calm it down, and a Chinese missile hits a U.S. warship. Could happen. What happens? As Jim said, we got into it with the Russians. Gosh, excuse me. You're going to shoot at us? We'll shoot back. What if China decides to militarily restrict passage of freighters and tankers in transit to Taiwan or Japan? It could happen. It's something that puts at a risk of real escalation to a regional war. And Jim says, well, the Chinese don't want that to happen, but a lot of these things can get out of hand, which is why we're really talking about accidental wars coming out of and the inability of the minor powers and the great powers to de-escalate the situation. Well, let's talk about the two Asian giants. I said, China versus India. Jim made the point that China is far more dependent today on imports, raw materials, energy, and it's still got an export economy, though it wants to become a consumer economy. Look at the commercial routes that begin in Southwest Asia and in Africa. They pass through the Indian Ocean, right past India. And then, of course, they squeeze at the Strait of Malacca. And I'll get to another scenario involving the Strait of Malacca, which connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea and the Pacific. Goes right by Singapore. India sits on it can physically impede the Chinese economy if one of these shooting confrontations in the Himalayas gets out of hand, and then India starts let's call it a long distance embargo of China, stopping freighters in the Indian Ocean. And China, in order to ensure that it can make India pay, there are all kinds of things they could do, firing missiles and the like, decides it wants to ensure that it can control access to the Strait of Malacca, and therefore mess with India's foreign trade. And they make a move on Singapore. Oh, would that be a major war? Maybe I'm going too far with this, but those are some of the things that admirals in Beijing think about. It's a scenario they've considered. They might like to recover that island. Here's another one too: anti-access area denial. We've got a lot on that on strategy page. That is what that was China's naval strategy, and the way that they have built their artificial islands in the South China Sea give you our way to illustrate what anti-access area denial is about. Not having the carriers or sufficient long-range aviation to actually continually control the South China Sea, they went for building these islands, essentially creating stationary carriers. And as Jim has pointed out in past strategy talks, they've got a lot of already intersecting fires from the islands they've already built. It is very, very difficult for a surface ship to move through that area and avoid being hit. I'm talking about like a commercial freighter. Avoid being hit by a anti-ship missile fired from one of the islands, or potentially fired from a Chinese attack sub as well, or Chinese aircraft. That is anti-access area denial, but it's also, as they improve the weapons, it is a threat to the United States Navy. And at one point, if they've reached a certain level of confidence, they'll say no more freedom of navigation operations. I'm sorry, we're going to deny it to you, and we've got the power to do that. It now belongs to us, no matter what the neighbors say and no matter what you say, the United States. Is that too far-fetched a diplomatic initiative by Beijing? Perhaps it is right now. Well, here's another accidental war scenario, at least think about. Jim's talked about that steerable anti-ship ballistic missile, DF-21. Now, I'm forgetting that this DF-21, it's a new modification, but Jim last wrote something about it just a couple of years ago. No, they really haven't. They certainly haven't tested it against a carrier battle group. But let's say they decide they want to fire a warning shot. Maybe they want to test it. Maybe they listened to Strategy Talk and they heard Jim Dunnigan say, hey, they haven't tested it. So they test it, firing it in the general direction of and claiming it's going to miss, but a warning shot at foreign warships. And let's say it hits an American ship. What happens? What happens? Far-fetched? Perhaps not. The thing is that you can't disagree with Jim's analysis about what the Chinese are up to, cabbage strategy. I've written several columns about that. That's what the Chinese admit to doing in the South China Sea. They make the territorial claim, and then here's the quote: they wrap them with ships, air patrols, and garrisons. Military layers akin to cabbage leaves. That was a term used by a Chinese general in 2013, and it's just strong enough that nobody really wants to test it. And that is the way the absorption strategy has proceeded. But it's also reached a point where India is collaborating with Japan, U.S., and Australia, and that some of the neighbors are vehemently objecting, Vietnam and the Philippines as well. So those are scenarios that the State Department had better have considered, because it's going to take some very fast-moving diplomacy to de-escalate it on the part of the United States and China. And there's also the third-party actor with an interest, Vietnam and the Philippines, and Taiwan. Don't leave them off that they couldn't get involved in something and escalate the situation in the South China Sea. Why does it matter? Jim's already talked about the Chinese economy, but let's talk about everybody's economy. $5 trillion in trade moves through the South China Sea. In global trade, $5 trillion worth of material goods on ships pass through the area every year. Yeah, a war there is going to deleteriously affect the global economy. You're going to kick off a recession, if not a depression, if a major war erupted in the area. In one way, that's something that gets the diplomats in Beijing and Washington active. But all of these little, some of them may be, again, I admit, far-fetched scenarios are potential igniters of a far larger war. And it's who's at fault there? It's China for going into the South China Sea, making the spurious claims that have been judged illegal, and at the same time, essentially a slow invasion using barges, construction crews, and concrete to build those artificial islands. That is not that's not positive diplomacy, and it's definitely not defensive, at least from the perspective of the Philippines and Vietnam. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to leave it. We've covered a lot of territory today, and our time's up. So we'll talk to both of you next time.
It'll come back.
Okay.
Bye.